Tonight we're diving into something a little darker, what it really meant to be born at the worst times in human history. Before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy winding down with these late-night history journeys. And if you feel like sharing, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to picture this little community scattered across time zones, all tuning in together. So, settle in. Let your body sink deeper into comfort and allow your mind to drift gently as we explore the fragile, uncertain experience of being human in the most unforgiving eras of the past. When we think of the worst time to be born, it's easy to imagine catastrophic wars or deadly plagues, and those moments were certainly devastating. But long before such events, the very act of being born at all was fraught with risk. For most of history, childbirth itself was one of the most dangerous events a person could face, both for mother and child. Without modern medicine, sterile tools, or trained doctors, many births ended in tragedy. A single infection, a complication, or even something as simple as the cord being wrapped around the infant's neck could mean loss of life. And for those who did survive, the earliest years of childhood were a test of resilience. Before vaccines, antibiotics, or even reliable clean water, children often succumbed to fevers, infections, or malnutrition. In many eras, nearly half of all children never lived to see their 5th birthday. Imagine that. In a family of 6 children, 3 might not survive into adulthood. It wasn't cruelty that caused this. It was simply the reality of living in a world without the protections we take for granted today. Survival itself was the daily challenge. But survival wasn't just about health. It also depended heavily on when and where you were born. Imagine arriving into the world during a famine. From the very first breath, food would be scarce. Your mother's milk might not come because her body was starving. Your family's crops might wither under drought or rot in floods. Or imagine being born into a region racked by conflict. Armies marching across fields, burning villages, taking whatever they needed to fuel their wars. A newborn in such times was not simply welcomed into a family, they were thrust into a world of instability. One where parents couldn't promise safety, nourishment, or even a roof overhead. Birthplace also decided your status. To be born the child of a king or noble was one thing. To be born into a poor peasant household was another. For some, birth meant wealth, comfort, and education. For most, it meant a lifetime of labor, often beginning in childhood, with little chance of escape. To be born human across most of history was to step into a world of danger and uncertainty. Today, we expect to live 70, 80, or even 90 years. But for much of the past, life expectancy hovered around 25 to 35 years. This number is a little misleading. If you survived childhood, you could live longer. But the reality is that so many never made it out of their first decade of life. And even for those who did, adulthood was shadowed by disease, accident, and violence. Imagine living without hospitals, without painkillers, without even the knowledge of germs. A cut on the hand while working in the fields could lead to infection. A broken bone could mean permanent disability. A simple cough might turn into something fatal. And then there were disasters, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and fires. Entire communities wiped away in a matter of hours. To be born in the wrong century often meant living in fear of forces far larger than yourself. You might be wondering, why focus on this darker side of history in a bedtime story? After all, isn't the goal of these journeys to relax, to drift off? And that's exactly why. There's something strangely comforting about looking back on the struggles of the past. It helps us appreciate the safety and stability of the present. It reminds us that humanity has endured extraordinary hardships, and yet we are still here. And it allows us, in the quiet hours of the night, to reflect on how fortunate it is that we were not born in some of those darker chapters of history. So, tonight, we'll gently move through time, visiting some of the hardest centuries and cruelest conditions to be born into. We'll explore the Ice Age, where survival was measured by fire and fur. The crowded cities of the ancient world, where disease spread faster than knowledge. The long, cold famines of the Middle Ages. The terror of the Black Death. The smoke-choked factories of the Industrial Age. And at each stage, we'll imagine what it meant to arrive as a small, fragile human in those moments. But before we move to specific ages, let's linger a little longer in the earliest days of humanity. Thousands of years ago, before written records, every birth was a gamble against the elements. Picture a small group of hunter-gatherers huddled in a cave against the chill of an ice age wind. A newborn arrives into this cold world. The group has no doctors, no sterile cloths, no certainty that mother or child will live through the night. They have only instinct, warmth from the fire, and the will to keep one another alive. Life expectancy wasn't simply low, it was uncertain. A child could grow into strength and live decades, or be lost in days. To be born then was to face the raw edge of existence, with no guarantees, and yet, from this fragile beginning, humanity endured. As we leave this opening chapter, we begin to see that being born at the worst times in history wasn't about one single event. It was about the sheer fragility of life before the safety nets of modernity. In the next part, we'll step further back into the world of our prehistoric ancestors to imagine in more detail what it truly felt like to begin life in the Ice Age, when survival was a daily battle against cold, hunger, and the unforgiving wild. So let your body grow heavier, your breath softer, as you drift into rest. Part 2 will continue this journey into the deep past, where the story of hardship begins. Imagine now that we are traveling back tens of thousands of years to a world far colder, wider, and more unforgiving than our own. This was the time of the Ice Age, when glaciers covered much of the land and survival depended on endurance, cooperation, and luck. A newborn arriving in such a world entered not into warmth and safety, but into uncertainty and danger. The first challenge was the climate itself. Temperatures could plummet far below freezing, and shelter was often little more than a cave, a crude hut of animal bones and hides, or a temporary camp of branches and fire. Families huddled together for warmth, their very breath forming clouds of mist in the frigid air. For an infant, every hour was a test. Without thick furs to swaddle them, without fire burning brightly, cold could seep into their fragile bodies. A chill we might shrug off today could have been fatal then. Food was never guaranteed. Hunter-gatherer groups moved constantly, following herds of animals, gathering berries, nuts, and roots. A good hunt might feed the group for days. A failed one meant hunger. Imagine a child being born at the start of a lean season, when game was scarce and plants lay hidden beneath snow. A mother's milk might be thin, her body weakened by lack of nourishment. The infant's tiny cries would compete with the silence of empty stomachs. Survival wasn't just about avoiding danger, it was about finding enough calories to greet tomorrow. And unlike today, where food can be stored or transported, everything then was fleeting. Meat spoiled quickly, berries withered, and grain had not yet been cultivated in abundance. Hunger was a familiar companion, and it made the act of bringing new life into the world even more precarious. Even if food was found, danger lurked on every horizon. The Ice Age world was filled with creatures far larger and more powerful than human. Saber-toothed cats, cave lions, dire wolves, and towering mammoths shared the land. For a newborn, the risks were immediate. Camps had to be guarded carefully. Fires needed to burn through the night, both for warmth and protection. A single lapse in vigilance could mean disaster. Parents carried their children close, wrapped tightly against their bodies as they foraged or traveled, but movement itself was perilous. An uneven step on frozen ground could cause a fall, an injury that without medical aid might end a life or leave someone unable to contribute to the group's survival. Every step was a reminder of fragility. Today, a fever is troubling but manageable. A small wound can be treated with a bandage, an infection with antibiotics. In prehistoric times, none of this existed. A scratch from a thorn, a bite from an insect, or a cut from a sharp stone tool could fester into something deadly. Childbirth itself, as we reflected in part 1, was among the greatest risks. A mother might bleed uncontrollably, or a child might struggle to emerge, with no remedies beyond the strength of those present. And for infants who were especially vulnerable, illness was nearly impossible to combat. A cough, a fever, or diarrhea could sweep through a group and claim the youngest lives. High infant mortality wasn't an exception, it was the expectation. For many groups, losing children was part of life, mourned deeply but accepted as the price of survival in such a harsh world. As if nature and illness weren't enough, other humans posed dangers too. Tribes competed for hunting grounds, water sources, and shelter. When resources grew scarce, violence erupted. Imagine a newborn carried on the mother's back as her group fled from raiders, running across frozen ground in the night, or a child being born into a tribe constantly under threat, where fear of attack never faded. Weapons were primitive, but effective spears, stone blades, and fire. Raids could mean displacement, the loss of food stores, or the destruction of carefully built shelters. For the youngest and weakest, survival in such moments depended entirely on the strength of their group. And yet, amid these hardships, life carried on. Families found joy in firelight, laughter in the discovery of fresh berries, hope in the successful hunt of a deer. Children were nurtured not just by their parents, but by entire groups, grandparents, siblings, uncles, and aunts, all shared in raising the young. But even in moments of warmth, uncertainty was constant. A newborn's first year was watched with quiet worry. Would they survive the winter? Would they grow strong enough to keep up? When the tribe moved again, the world was smaller and more immediate. There were no long-term plans, no thoughts of decades ahead. Survival meant making it through the next storm, the next hunt, the next night. For those born into this era, existence was both fragile and resilient. Fragile because so many lives were cut short. Resilient because against all odds, humanity endured, adapted, and found ways to thrive. When we look back at the Ice Age and the hardships of early humanity, it becomes clear why being born then might be considered one of the worst times in history. Every breath was uncertain, every tomorrow a question mark. And yet, those who survived carried forward the strength of countless generations, slowly shaping the path that led to us. As you drift into rest, imagine the crackle of a fire in a cold cave, the muffled whispers of a tribe protecting its young, and the steady heartbeat of survival against impossible odds. And in our next part, we'll move forward to the birth of ancient civilizations, where life seemed more organized, but where new miseries awaited in the crowded, disease-filled cities of humanity's first great empire. The Ice Age slowly loosened its grip, and with warmer climates came new possibilities. Humans discovered ways to plant crops, to domesticate animals, to build permanent settlements. On the surface, this shift promised stability, a way to escape the endless wandering of the hunter-gatherer life. But for those born into the world's first great civilizations, life was not always the paradise it might seem from a distance. In many ways, new hardships arose, ones that made being born in this era just as difficult, if not more so, than in the wild expanses of prehistory. Imagine being born in one of the first villages along the fertile rivers of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley. To modernize, these places might seem advanced, organized agriculture, irrigation systems, even early writing. But daily life for most people was grueling. Families worked the land from dawn to dusk, their survival tied entirely to the success of crops. A failed harvest meant famine, and famine meant death, not just for individuals but for entire communities. A child born in such times might face hunger not just for days but for months, as food ran out and reserves dwindled. And unlike the nomadic life, where tribes could move to new hunting grounds, these early farmers were tied to their land. If the river failed, if the soil gave way, if drought lingered, they had nowhere else to go. As villages grew into towns, and towns into cities, another invisible danger emerged: disease. Crowded together in close quarters, with poor sanitation and no understanding of germs, people lived side by side with filth. Waste flowed through streets, water was easily contaminated, and food spoiled quickly in the heat. For infants and children, this was deadly. Diarrhea, fevers, and infections swept through homes relentlessly. A newborn's survival was often a matter of chance. Parents might cradle one baby while mourning another, all in the same season. The growth of trade only increased the spread of sickness. A merchant arriving from far away might carry not only goods but also illnesses unfamiliar to the local population, against which no one had any defenses. In this way, civilization amplified one of humanity's greatest threats: the spread of disease. Another harsh reality of ancient civilizations was the sheer weight of inequality. In small hunter-gatherer groups, survival was shared. In cities, hierarchies took shape. For a child born into a wealthy household, life could bring learning, luxury, and power. But for the vast majority, birth meant a lifetime of labor. Peasants toiled in fields they did not own, paying taxes or tribute to rulers. Children often worked as soon as they were able, carrying water, tending animals, or helping in harvests. And for some, birth meant slavery. To be born the child of a slave was to inherit bondage, a life without freedom, spent in service to others. Imagine beginning life already owned by someone else, your days not your own, your labor demanded, your future decided before you could speak. Ancient civilizations also tied daily life to powerful systems of religion and law. To be born under the shadow of gods and kings was to be bound by rules far beyond personal control. In Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi laid out punishments for crimes, many of them severe. A child growing up under such laws would learn quickly that mistakes could cost dearly. In Egypt, pharaohs were seen as divine, their decrees shaping every aspect of life. To question authority was unthinkable. Religion offered comfort, yes, but also fear. Displeasing the gods, failing in ritual, or being born under an ill omen could weigh heavily on families. Some children were seen as blessed, others as cursed, and the difference shaped how they were treated. What did it feel like, then, to be a child in these first civilizations? The day began with chores, fetching water, grinding grain, tending fires. Play existed, of course, but work often overshadowed it. Toys were simple, made from clay or wood, and lessons came not from schools but from imitation. Boys might learn farming or craft skills from fathers. Girls might learn cooking or weaving from mothers. Yet the world around them was filled with uncertainty. A flood might wash away fields. A drought might leave the earth cracked and barren. Wars between rival cities could send armies marching through, burning homes, seizing supplies. For the youngest, each new sound, the clash of weapons, the howl of storms, the cries of the hungry, was a reminder that safety was never guaranteed. It's tempting to see the dawn of civilization as progress, a step forward from the wandering hardships of the Ice Age. And in many ways, it was. These societies built monuments, created art, developed languages that allowed knowledge to be passed on. But for those born into them, the price was high. Children grew up bound to labor, hemmed in by hierarchy, vulnerable to disease, and always at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. Birth itself remained a gamble. And even for those who survived, life was a cycle of toil, hunger, and fear. Civilization had given humanity structure, but it had also given humanity new forms of suffering. As we pause here, reflect on the paradox of progress. To be born into the first civilizations was to live in communities rich with culture, but poor in comfort. It was to be part of a grand experiment in human history, but one where the individual paid dearly for survival. In the next part, we'll move into the classical world of Greece and Rome, often remembered for philosophy, art, and empire. Yet, behind the beauty and brilliance of these ages lay new disasters, plagues, wars, and the endless struggle of those who had no choice but to be born into fragile times. So, as you drift deeper into rest, let your mind wander through those early cities, their crowded streets and flickering oil lamps, where each cry of a newborn was both a celebration of life and a prayer for survival. As we leave the earliest cities behind, we enter a world that, on the surface, seems brighter sunlit temples, bustling marketplaces, and the music of learning in the city-states of Greece. Civilization had advanced, ideas were flourishing, and humans were creating culture that still resonates today. But life was still fragile, especially for the youngest. The classical world was a place of beauty and brilliance, but also of danger, disease, and uncertainty. Being born into this era was to step into a world where death often lingered just out of sight. Consider Athens, around 430 BCE, a city celebrated for democracy and philosophy. Yet it was also a city in turmoil, caught in the throes of the Peloponnesian War. Armies marched through the countryside, supplies dwindled, and the population crowded into the city walls to escape invading forces. For infants and children, this was no abstract danger, it was immediate and pressing. Overcrowding meant limited space, less food, and closer contact with the sick. Noise, tension, and fear filled the city. Every day was a delicate balancing act between survival and despair. And then came the plague. The plague struck Athens with brutal swiftness. It killed young and old, rich and poor indiscriminately. The exact cause is still debated, but contemporary accounts speak of fever, thirst, sores, and relentless suffering. Entire households were devastated in a matter of weeks. Imagine being born into such a time, tiny and helpless, your body unprepared for the infections that swept through the city. Parents were often unable to care for every child. Families were torn apart. Some children survived, but many did not. Their lives claimed by an illness no one could understand or control. The plague also brought social chaos. Laws and customs faltered under pressure. Fear overshadowed reason. People avoided one another. Rituals went unperformed, and hope seemed scarce. For those entering the world in such a period, life began with uncertainty in its purest form. Athens was not alone in its suffering. Rome, the rising empire, faced its own daily perils. Fires could sweep through wooden neighborhoods, destroying homes in minutes. Floods from the Tiber River could drown streets, carrying disease and death. Even the earth itself posed danger. Earthquakes could crumble buildings and leave thousands homeless. And yet, the classical world often celebrated its resilience. Citizens built aqueducts to bring water, amphitheaters to gather, and walls to protect. But these measures could not erase the constant undercurrent of mortality. Births occurred in this environment of uncertainty, and every newborn carried the weight of precarious survival. Across Greece, Rome, and other classical civilizations, infant mortality remained shockingly high. While some children survived, many were lost in their first year due to disease, malnutrition, or infection. Families adapted rituals around this reality. Names might not be given until a child survived the first days, and many households mourned quietly for the lives that never reached maturity. Life was precious precisely because it was so uncertain. And to be born during such times was to gamble against forces entirely beyond human control. War was a constant companion to life in the classical world. Armies moved not just for conquest, but for survival and power. Territories were conquered, cities burned, and the spoils of victory often included the youngest and weakest. Imagine a newborn carried on the back of a fleeing mother as enemy forces approached. Imagine children born into households where fathers were conscripted and mothers left to feed and protect them alone. Hunger and danger were inseparable companions in these times. Even in peace, the threat of raids or local conflicts could destabilize communities, leaving families in constant vigilance. Being born in such a world meant that life was never guaranteed. Every step, every breath, every day was a gift won against the odds. Despite these dangers, the classical world still nurtured human potential. Markets offered trade, storytellers offered wonder, and temples offered meaning. Children were cherished, taught through play and observation, and slowly integrated into their families' roles. But the fragility of life remained ever present. A walk through the streets could expose one to thieves, disease, or accidents. A storm could wash away crops. A sudden illness could strike without warning. To be born was to exist in constant tension between life and death, even amid civilization's greatest achievements. Looking back at the classical world, it's easy to admire the achievements of Athens, Sparta, and Rome, the philosophies, the architecture, the art. But beneath the surface lay a world where survival was never guaranteed, where being born human meant entering a life filled with uncertainty, risk, and sorrow, and yet life endured. Those who survived carried forward not only their own genes, but the resilience, ingenuity, and spirit of their communities. Every newborn who lived was a quiet triumph against the harshness of the era. As we pause here, let yourself imagine the flickering oil lamps in Athenian homes, the crowded streets of Rome, the whispered conversations of worried parents. Each newborn represented hope and fragility intertwined. In the next part, we'll journey into the fall of Rome and the so-called Dark Ages, a period where life could be even harsher and where the safety and stability of civilization often vanished entirely. So allow your body to sink deeper, your breath to slow, and your mind to drift through the ancient cities, their beauty shadowed by the ever-present reminder of mortality. As the classical world faded, the mighty cities and empires of Greece and Rome faced decline. The grandeur of marble temples, the echoes of philosophical debates, and the orderly streets of Rome slowly gave way to uncertainty and chaos. For those born during this period, life could feel precarious in ways that few earlier generations had experienced. The fall of the Western Roman Empire around 476 CE did not happen overnight. It was a long, drawn-out unraveling of political structures, economies, and social safety. Cities that had once thrived became vulnerable to invasion, famine, and neglect. Roads fell into disrepair, aqueducts dried up, and law enforcement vanished from many regions. For a child born in these centuries, every day carried uncertainty. In Rome itself, markets no longer guaranteed steady food. families often struggled to provide even basic sustenance. Grain shipments from distant provinces were delayed or intercepted, leaving local populations hungry. In rural areas, where peasants tilled the land, taxes remained steep even as central authority weakened. A poor harvest could mean starvation. Without strong governance, protection against raiders and bandits became scarce. To be born into a family without resources was to face a lifetime of hardship from the very first breath. The so-called Dark Ages were marked by migrations and invasions. Germanic tribes, Huns, and other groups swept across former Roman territories. Villages were burned, livestock stolen, and families displaced. Imagine a newborn carried by a mother fleeing her home, across rivers swollen by rain and over fields trampled by armies. The cries of infants mixed with the chaos of conflict, a constant reminder that survival depended not only on the strength of one's body, but on luck, timing, and the protection of one's community. For children born into this era, the risk of dying young was heightened by both human and natural forces. Without medicine, without stable food sources, and without protection from the political turmoil, childhood itself became a battleground. Collapse of infrastructure also meant the collapse of sanitation and health. Water sources became contaminated, food storage was unreliable, and malnutrition weakened entire communities. Epidemics spread swiftly, and smallpox, measles, and other illnesses claimed the lives of the most vulnerable. Famine often followed war. Crops were destroyed during raids, stored grain was stolen, and weather fluctuations brought unpredictable harvests. A child born during these decades might face months without sufficient nourishment, their growth stunted, their body vulnerable to disease, and yet families adapted. Communities pooled resources, shared knowledge of edible plants, and moved to safer locations when possible. Still, survival was never guaranteed, and the fragility of life remained ever present. Another consequence of Rome's fall was the loss of learning and organization. Libraries were destroyed, roads fell into ruin, and much of the administrative knowledge that had once allowed cities to function efficiently disappeared. For a child, this meant growing up in a world where guidance was scarce. Where previously a midwife might have access to medical texts, now she relied solely on experience and memory. Where roads had once connected communities, now isolation made it harder to seek help in emergencies. Birth in such times was not only entering a world of physical danger, it was entering a world with limited tools to prevent it. Though we often focus on physical survival, the uncertainty of these centuries carried a psychological weight for those who survived. Families lived under constant fear of attack, famine, and disease. Social bonds were crucial, and communities had to rely on trust and cooperation to endure. For children, this created a reality in which life felt unpredictable. Childhood was often shorter, play curtailed by the need to help with survival tasks. Parents taught caution, vigilance, and resilience early, knowing that mistakes could be fatal. And yet, even in this harsh world, life endured. People found ways to adapt, to form communities, to continue traditions. Even the youngest who survived these early trials carried forward the resilience of generations. Birth in these centuries may have been precarious, but it was also the beginning of survival against tremendous odds. Every infant who lived to adulthood represented the persistence of humanity in a time when so many forces worked against it. As we leave the remnants of Rome behind and step further into the early Middle Ages, allow your mind to drift through villages surrounded by forests, rivers, and ruins. Hear the distant sounds of travelers on uncertain roads, the whispers of families gathered around fires, and the soft cries of newborns whose lives hung delicately in balance. In the next part, we will move into the Black Death, a century of suffering and mortality so severe that being born then meant facing some of the most extreme challenges in human history. So let your body grow heavier, your breath slow, and your imagination wander through the shadows and flickering lights of a world in transition, where every birth was a story of both hope and fragility. As we move into the 14th century, Europe and parts of Asia faced a catastrophe unlike any other. The Black Death, a plague that swept through continents with terrifying speed, reshaped societies, and left an indelible mark on history. For those born during this era, life was a precarious balance of fear, survival, and the constant presence of death. Imagine arriving into the world at this time. The first sounds you hear are not the lullabies of calm households, but the distant toll of church bells signaling yet another death. The air carries whispers of illness, and families move cautiously, knowing that no one, not even the young or innocent, is truly safe. The Black Death likely began in Central Asia and spread along trade routes carried by fleas on rats, infecting cities and villages in its wake. It arrived suddenly, striking towns that had never experienced anything like it before. Within weeks, communities were overwhelmed, and the sick filled homes, streets, and cemeteries alike. For infants, the risk was extreme. Their small, fragile bodies had no defense against the fever, swelling, and coughing that accompanied the plague. Parents could do little but comfort, shield, and hope. Many children never lived to see their first birthdays. And in some areas, half of the population perished within months, leaving towns and villages eerily empty. Daily routines changed overnight. Markets, once bustling, emptied as fear spread. Roads were abandoned. People avoided contact, even with neighbors. Family units were strained. Some were torn apart entirely, as adults fell ill and could not care for their young. Births continued, of course, but each one was shadowed by danger. Midwives, themselves vulnerable, worked tirelessly, moving between homes, often falling ill themselves. For families who survived, every healthy infant was a small miracle, a symbol of hope amid despair. Even simple necessities, food, clean water, warmth, became difficult to secure. Famine followed in the wake of disease. As farmers died, fields were left untended, and trade was disrupted. Children were doubly at risk, both from plague and from hunger. The Black Death was not only a physical challenge, it imposed immense psychological strain. Communities struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Religious explanations abounded. Some believed it was God's punishment, others turned to superstition. Fear led to isolation, distrust, and sometimes violence, as people searched for someone to blame. For children, this created a world of constant tension. Their caregivers, preoccupied with survival, could not offer the same security and reassurance as in safer times. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and colored by a pervasive sense of dread. Historians estimate that the Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia. Entire villages vanished, families disappeared, generations were interrupted. Imagine being born into a family already weakened by illness or the loss of relatives. Every new life was both precious and precarious. Even those who survived childhood lived with the scars of trauma. Social structures were disrupted, and the traditional supports that might have helped a newborn were often absent. Survival was not guaranteed by care alone. Luck and timing played enormous roles, and yet life endured. Communities slowly adapted, learning to avoid infected areas, improving hygiene where possible, and adjusting social behaviors. Infants who survived became part of a generation that carried forward knowledge, resilience, and adaptation learned under extreme pressure. Every birth was a triumph in the face of overwhelming odds. Every child who lived was a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, life could persist. To be born during the Black Death was to inherit uncertainty and danger from the moment of your first breath. Death was close, and survival depended on the delicate balance of care, circumstance, and sheer fortune. Yet, this era also highlights the enduring human spirit. Those who survived helped rebuild communities, cultivate new strategies for survival, and pass on lessons that would shape the generations to come. Being born into such a world meant starting life at the edge of mortality, but it also meant entering a story of perseverance and adaptation. As you drift gently, imagine villages emptied of familiar faces, fields left fallow, and the quiet resilience of those who remained. Picture infants held close, their breaths warm against a mother's chest, the soft flicker of candlelight in otherwise darkened homes. In the next part, we will explore the age of famine, endless wars, a time when cold climates, failed crops, and endless conflict made life even harsher, and being born human could feel like stepping into a storm without shelter. So allow your mind to relax, your body to sink deeper, and your imagination to wander through the eerie, silent streets of plague-stricken towns, where every heartbeat is both a struggle and a triumph. After the devastation of the Black Death, Europe and parts of Asia struggled to recover. Yet the centuries that followed were far from gentle. For those born during the late Middle Ages, life was a fragile and often terrifying balance between hunger, disease, and conflict. This era, sometimes called the Age of Famine and Endless Wars, was one of the harshest periods in human history. Imagine arriving into the world during this time. Your first cries might be met not with comfort, but with concern for survival. Every newborn faced risks from the very first moment: an unstable food supply, harsh winters, and the constant threat of violence. Famines were frequent and relentless. Crop failures could occur from drought, flooding, or unusually cold summers. The Little Ice Age, beginning around the 14th century, brought colder temperatures and unpredictable weather, which devastated harvests across Europe and Asia. Families struggled to find enough to eat. Bread, the staple for many, was often coarse and insufficient. Grain shortages meant that children received minimal nourishment, leaving them weak and more susceptible to illness. Infants, in particular, were vulnerable, dependent entirely on the nutrition their mothers could provide. Famine also led to secondary dangers. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, making disease far more deadly. Parents faced the heartbreaking reality of watching their children grow frail, powerless to change the outcome. While famine sapped strength, war brought direct danger. From local skirmishes to larger conflicts, Europe was rarely at peace. The 100 Years' War between England and France, skirmishes among city-states in Italy, and raids by mercenary bands created an environment where violence was ever present. Imagine a child born into a village threatened by raiders. Families might flee with their youngest bundled in blankets, crossing rivers or forests in search of safety. Homes could be burned, livestock stolen, and parents killed, leaving children orphaned before they could even walk. Survival depended on both luck and the protection of the community. Even in areas not actively at war, the fear of raids and conscription affected daily life. Families kept watch, children learned early the signs of danger, and every step outside the safety of the home carried risk. The combination of famine and war made populations especially vulnerable to disease. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and dysentery spread quickly among crowded or weakened communities. Infants and children, with their tiny bodies and underdeveloped immune systems, were most at risk. Without medicine or understanding of germs, parents relied on traditional remedies, herbs, charms, and prayers. Some helped, some did nothing, and some caused harm. But the odds were stacked against survival. Each day was a quiet negotiation with mortality. Amid these hardships, daily life was harsh, even for children who survived infancy. Boys and girls worked from an early age, helping in fields, fetching water, or tending to animals. Education, if it existed, was limited to religious instruction or apprenticeship. Play was a luxury, often deferred in favor of survival tasks. Childhood was brief and fragile. Infants depended entirely on adults for nourishment, warmth, and protection, and even the most diligent caregivers could not shield them from all dangers. A child's life hung delicately in the balance, influenced by weather, harvests, epidemics, and human cruelty alike. The age of famine and endless wars also highlighted stark social divides. Wealthy families might have stored grain, maintained fortified homes, and avoided the brunt of conflict. For the majority, however, birth meant a life of vulnerability. Peasant families faced relentless toil, and a newborn survival was never guaranteed. Orphans and abandoned children were especially at risk, forced to navigate a harsh world without guidance or protection. Survival depended not only on chance, but also on the networks of extended families and communities, which were themselves under constant strain. Yet, even in these dark centuries, humanity endured. Families adapted to shortages, cultivated new crops, and rebuilt after attack. Communities found ways to protect their young, sharing resources and knowledge to help infants survive. Every child who lived through famine and war represented quiet courage and resilience. Their survival carried forward the hope and strength of their communities, allowing humanity to persist despite seemingly insurmountable odds. As you listen, imagine cold winters in rural villages, empty granaries, and families huddled around fires, protecting the youngest from hunger and danger. Picture children learning early the skills needed to survive, observing adults navigating scarcity and conflict with quiet determination. Being born during this time meant entering a world where life was fragile, uncertain, and often brutal, but also where perseverance and human ingenuity were tested and proven. As your body sinks deeper and your breath slows, let your mind wander through this time of hardship, famine, and endless conflict. Picture infants held close, mothers cradling them through nights of uncertainty, and communities struggling to keep life alive against a backdrop of scarcity and danger. In the next part, we will move into the exploration and colonial era, a period of expansion and discovery that brought both wonder and new dangers for those born at the edges of the known world. As the world emerged from the late Middle Ages, humanity entered an era of exploration and empire building. Across oceans and continents, new lands were claimed, vast empires expanded, and trade networks stretched further than ever before. On the surface, this period was full of discovery, wealth, and technological advancement. But for those born into these turbulent times, life could be harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving. Imagine arriving into the world at the edge of a colonial outpost, Your first sounds might be the cries of settlers, the barking of distant guards, or the clash of ships rigging in the harbor. Birth was not only a physical event, but also a doorway into systems of power that could dictate every aspect of your life. European powers, in search of wealth, land, and influence, established colonies across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. For indigenous populations, this meant sudden upheaval. Families were uprooted, lands seized, and communities disrupted. A child born into an indigenous family during colonization faced immediate danger. Settler violence, forced relocation, and the introduction of new diseases created a perilous environment. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly among populations with no immunity. Many children never survived their first years. Even those born into settler families experienced challenges. Life in colonies was harsh, supplies were limited, and survival often required constant labor. Birth did not guarantee security. It meant entering a world of uncertainty and risk, where danger could come from the land, the sea, or other humans. One of the darkest aspects of this era was the expansion of slavery. Millions were forcibly taken from Africa and transported across oceans under horrific conditions. Birth within these systems carried a predetermined fate. Survival often depended on endurance, obedience, and luck. Infants born into slavery were particularly vulnerable. The harsh conditions of transport and labor left little room for care. Mortality rates for newborns were staggering, as disease, malnutrition, and abuse claimed countless lives. Families were often separated, leaving children to grow up without parents or kin, entirely dependent on strangers for survival. Beyond the colonies, many empires enforced strict hierarchies and oppressive laws. In places like the Ottoman Empire, Mughal India, and European monarchies, birth often determined your social position and prospects. For the majority, being born meant entering a life of labor, limited freedom, and few opportunities. Children born into lower classes were expected to contribute from an early age. Boys might learn trades or serve as soldiers, while girls assisted in household labor or agricultural work. Education was a privilege for the wealthy, leaving the majority dependent on instinct, apprenticeship, or family guidance for survival. Even in households with relative security, disease, accidents, and poor medical knowledge threatened newborns and young children. High infant mortality remained a constant reality, shaping how families planned, nurtured, and mourned. The colonial and early modern period was also a time of near constant conflict. Wars between empires, rebellions within colonies, and pirate raids on trade ships created peril for everyone, including the youngest. Imagine a child born on a coastal settlement where pirate attacks could strike without warning, or in a city threatened by armies marching across borders. Families adapted to these dangers, but for a newborn, Safety was fragile and dependent on the vigilance of caregivers and the unpredictability of the world around them. Medicine remained primitive. Small injuries could become deadly infections, and epidemics continued to ravage populations. Infant mortality remained extremely high, particularly in crowded cities, colonies, and labor camps. Parents relied on herbal remedies, religious rituals, and midwives' experience to protect their children. But many threats were beyond human control. Survival was often determined by chance, environment, and the strength of the infant itself. Childhood in this period was brief and challenging. Play was limited. Work began early, and education was a luxury. Infants and children were vulnerable to exploitation, neglect, and environmental dangers, yet families continued to care for their young as best they could. Communities often provided networks of support, but these were strained under the pressures of empire, labor demands, famine, and disease. To be born human in this era was to enter a world where survival was never guaranteed, and every day required resilience, adaptability, and endurance. Being born during the age of empires meant confronting a world shaped by power, exploitation, and inequality. It was an era of exploration, wealth, and cultural exchange, but also of oppression, displacement, and peril. Infants faced a future defined by forces far beyond their control, from the violence of conquest to the ravages of disease. Yet even in these harsh times, life endured. Those who survived carried forward the resilience of families and communities. Every newborn who lived was a quiet triumph against circumstances designed to suppress or endanger them. As you relax and drift deeper into sleep, imagine coastal settlements and bustling ports, crowded cities and remote plantations. Picture families cradling infants amid uncertainty, ships sailing under stormy skies, and communities struggling to preserve life and hope in the face of unimaginable challenges. In the next part, we will explore the Industrial Revolution, a period of rapid technological change and urbanization that brought new opportunities but also new dangers for the youngest among us. As the world entered the Industrial Revolution, beginning in the late 18th century, humanity witnessed remarkable change. Machines transformed production, cities grew rapidly, and the global economy expanded. But beneath the smoke-filled skies of factories and the clatter of machinery, a new set of hardships awaited those born into this era. For infants and children, being born during the industrial age often meant facing dangers previously unimaginable. Imagine the newborn entering the world in a crowded industrial city. The first sounds might be the roar of machinery, the clatter of carts on cobblestone streets, and the cries of neighbors in densely packed tenements. Life in these urban centers was fast, noisy, and unforgiving. Cities swelled with workers seeking jobs in factories. Tenements rose quickly, built to house as many families as possible in the smallest spaces. Sanitation lagged far behind growth. Streets were filled with waste, water supplies were contaminated, and diseases like cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis spread quickly. Infants were particularly vulnerable. Small, fragile bodies struggled to survive in these conditions, and infant mortality rates soared. Parents often had little ability to protect their young from infection. Birth did not guarantee survival. Every day was a careful negotiation with sickness and environment. For many families, economic necessity meant that children began work almost as soon as they could walk. Infants were often carried by mothers into factories or workshops, exposed to smoke, dust, and hazardous machinery. Older children worked long hours under grueling conditions, while education remained a distant luxury. Being born into a working-class family meant that childhood was brief, and survival was intertwined with labor. For some, life began in the shadows of machines that could injure or kill, with little protection or oversight. Every step, every breath, every day carried risk. Industrial cities were dangerous environments. Open flames, unstable buildings, polluted rivers, and busy streets posed constant threats. Accidents claimed the lives of children and adults alike. For infants, the dangers were less obvious, but no less real. Disease, malnutrition, and neglect were silent killers that claimed countless lives in the shadows of industrial progress. Even middle and upper-class families were not entirely safe. Epidemics swept through cities indiscriminately, and poor hygiene, limited medical knowledge, and crowded homes made survival fragile for all. While some benefited from the wealth created by industrialization, many lived in abject poverty. Wages were low, rents high, and access to food uncertain. Malnutrition was common, and infants often arrived into families already struggling to provide adequate sustenance. This scarcity compounded the risks of disease. Weak, undernourished bodies could not fight off infections. High infant mortality was a quiet, constant reality, shaping family life and community structures. Urbanization brought more than physical dangers. It created social pressures. Families were often isolated, support networks fractured, and communities crowded. Parents worked long hours, leaving little time to care for their children. The youngest members of society depended entirely on the strength, presence, and luck of those around them. For infants and children, life was a delicate balance of survival, hope, and endurance. Play was rare, comfort limited, and every day presented new challenges. Yet, even amid these challenges, life endured. Families adapted to harsh conditions, communities offered mutual support, and slowly, reform movements began advocating for safer conditions, shorter working hours, and public health improvements. Infants who survived these early hardships became part of a generation that would carry forward both resilience and the lessons learned under adversity. Every newborn who lived in these industrial cities represented the triumph of life over the harsh realities of urbanization and mechanization. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine smoky streets, crowded homes, and the relentless hum of machinery. Picture mothers cradling infants while navigating polluted alleyways, families sharing scarce resources, and children learning to survive in a world that demanded endurance from the moment they were born. The industrial age transformed human society, but it also reminded us that progress often comes with hidden costs, particularly for the most vulnerable among us. Let your mind linger on the flickering lamplight of tenement rooms, the distant whistle of factory chimneys, and the soft, fragile breath of newborns held close by tired hands. Every birth was a story of resilience in a world filled with new dangers and relentless change. In the final part, we will explore the modern era's perils, where wars, pandemics, and inequality continue to make being born a challenge, but where hope and survival strategies increasingly shaped humanity's future. As we arrive at the present day, it's natural to pause and reflect on the long journey we've taken through time. From the fragile infants of the Ice Age, through the chaos of ancient plagues and empires, to the smoke-filled streets of industrial cities, humanity has faced countless challenges. Each era brought its own trials, starvation, disease, war, and oppression, but also remarkable resilience and adaptability. Was there truly a worse time to be born? Or is it more accurate to see each period as a series of different hardships shaped by the environment, technology, and social structures of the day? Every newborn faced uncertainty, yet every newborn who survived contributed to the persistence and progress of our species. Compared to those who came before, we live in a time of extraordinary safety and opportunity. Modern medicine, vaccinations, clean water, and sanitation have dramatically increased survival rates for infants and children. Nutrition and access to food are more reliable than ever before in human history. Though life is not without challenges, and no society is perfect, being born today means entering a world that is safer, healthier, and far more stable than almost any prior era. Diseases that once claimed millions are now preventable or treatable. Peace and governance, where they exist, provide protections unimaginable to previous generations. Take a quiet moment to breathe in this realization. Every modern birth is a chance to thrive in ways that were once nearly impossible. Every heartbeat is supported by centuries of human ingenuity and sacrifice. As you settle deeper into your bed, allow yourself to feel gratitude for doctors, scientists, caregivers, and the countless individuals who worked to make life safer. Reflect on the comfort of modern homes, the warmth of a secure bed, and the knowledge that you are resting in one of humanity's safest moments. The struggles of the past remind us how far we've come and highlight the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Every challenge faced by previous generations shaped the opportunities we enjoy today. Every birth that survived against the odds is part of a long story of perseverance, hope, and courage. Now, let your body sink further into comfort, your breath slow and steady. Let your mind drift over the millennia, picturing the infants and children who came before and feeling a quiet connection to their resilience. Rest peacefully, knowing you live in a time of relative safety and care, where survival is less of a struggle and your dreams are free to unfold without constant fear. Let sleep take you gently and carry you into a night of calm, restorative rest. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with peace and quiet wonder.